A gourmet dinner turned deadly, and now Wolfe smells more than herbs in the air. Welcome to Wolfe Mysteries. I'm your host. Let's keep this community vibrant. Drop a comment with your location. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. In the Wolfe household, three things are sacred: the orchids, the schedule, and the sanctity of a salad. So when a man stormed the brownstone at 3:47 p.m., uninvited, unannounced, reeking of desperation and cologne, I knew this wasn't ending with a handshake and a come back later. I was at my desk, half reading an old gazette, mostly timing Fritz's latest spat with the produce guy over chervil to romaine ratios. Wolfe was upstairs, lost in his orchid ritual, leaving me to handle whatever maniac had just yanked our doorbell like it was a lifeboat cord. He was tall, pale, sweating through a suit too expensive for his panicked expression, an expression that screamed he might cry, swing, or both. In his left hand, a small wooden box. His right was balled up like it was gripping a ghost. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, shoving past me like I was a chatty lamp. "That's a problem," I said, blocking his path with my best, be reasonable smile. "Mr. Wolfe's with his orchids and won't budge unless you're Sherlock's ghost or the Pope with a poisoned meatball." "Bryce Toiver," he snapped. "Toiver Culinary Group." I raised an eyebrow. "Congrats." He exhaled hard and dropped the box on my desk with a dull thud. He flipped it open, revealing a sealed glass jar packed with what looked like golden croutons. "I'm being sabotaged," he said. "This is proof." I've seen all sorts of relics land in front of Wolfe bloody handkerchiefs, torn stock certificates, even a lipstick-smeared cigarette case. But breadcrumbs in a jar? That was new. "You want Wolfe to autopsy your salad?" He jabbed a finger at the jar like it was a live grenade. "Those croutons were never meant to be served. Someone swapped ingredients at Ambrosia, our flagship restaurant, on the opening night of our new tasting menu. There was garlic in them." "Garlic," I whistled. "Call the feds." He shook his head so fast, his tie nearly took flight. "Our clientele is elite half are allergic, the other half rich enough to fake it. We had 3 walkouts, 1 near anaphylactic episode, and the press is circling like sharks. You want us to find who baked the wrong bread cubes? I want Nero Wolfe to find who's trying to ruin my company, discredit my name, and torch a decade of work. This isn't a joke, Mr. Goodwin. It's war." I'd send a guy like this, packing with a flyer and a coupon to a private detective who worked out of a deli, but something in his voice hit that rare nerve. It wasn't fear, it was personal, and spite, as Wolfe once said, is a richer motivator than money or guilt still needed. Wolfe's buy-in, and he wasn't likely to lift a finger, let alone his entire bulk for a crouton scandal. "You consider while I ask," I told. "Tour, but don't touch anything. And don't follow me." He doesn't like strangers or clients. Before beer, I headed up the stairs preparing for a quick dismissal. But Wolfe surprised me, listened. He asked exactly 3 questions, then he nodded once slowly. "Bring him up," he said, "and tell Fritz to throw out the garlic, all of it." So that's how it started, with a Sweetie restaurant tour, a jar of treasonous croutons, and Wolfe saying yes, for reasons he wouldn't tell me. And I, Archie Goodwin, would have known then. If Wolfe was interested in breadcrumbs, it meant someone had already started to crumble. A taste of intrusion. The brownstone has a rhythm, not a beat Udin's to, but a slow, deliberate tempo, like a cathedral clock. Everything has its place. Fritz in the kitchen, Wolfe in the plant rooms or behind his desk, and somewhere in between doing the things Wolfe won't, and Fritz refuses to understand, disrupt that rhythm, and you get dissonance. Bring in a stranger, and you might as well strike a tuning fork on Wolfe's forehead. Bryce Toiver sat stiffly in the red leather chair, knee staggered there like he was trying not to leave a wrinkle in the air. I had escorted him up no small feat, considering the number of subtle cues Wolfe emits to discourage unnecessary human proximity. As we entered the office, Wolfe glanced up from the orchid. catalog he hadn't been reading and gave Toiver a look. I've seen sink-stronger men mild interest filtered through 20 layers of irritation. I do not eat garlic. Wolfe bacon without preamble. I do not cook with it. I do not permit it in this house that. Your case involves the sabotage of a crouton is the only reason you are not already in the street, to swallowed like the air had thickened. I wouldn't have come unless I believed this was about more than food. Wolfe grunted. We shall see. You will begin. Pleased with the precise composition of your culinary enterprise, Toiver launched into it like a sowl under pressure. Tolliver Culinary Group wasn't just a restaurant brand. It was an empire in the making. Ambrosia, his flagship in Soho, had recently relaunched. With a seasonal tasting menu, critics were circling like wine waiters. Investors were sniffing around for expansion. Everything was aligned until Thursday night. Third course, he said, an heirloom panzanella with smoked lemon vinaigrette. The croutons were rosemary bile lightly pan-fried. No garlic, absolute talent, no. But someone added it, whether in the bread, the oil, or as a late-stage sabotage. I don't know. What I do know is that it wasn't an accident. Wolfe Persetti's lips and your own kitchen is incapable of error. I built that kitchen. Tover said, his voice edging toward passion. Every ingredient is vetted. Every staff member trained. No one adds garlic without it going through 4 hands unless one of the 4 wished it done. Yes, I stepped in. You're not. Buying blackmailed. No, not yet. No letters, no demands, just the ruined service and whispers. 3 customers have canceled their bookings for the month. One of them was a food critic. Another was a silent partner. Wolfe shifted slightly in his chair, which, in his world, counts as a standing ovation. Have you brought the contaminated product? The jar. I took it from the prep station after the night did. I couldn't trust anyone else to handle it. Wolfe nodded. Once I shall note open it, Mr. Goodwin will have it analyzed. The results may be useful later, but I am not a chemist. My concern is this: what was the act meant to communicate? His eyes darkened at. I'm not in control, which to Wolfe was the gravest sin imaginable. We got named staff executives a list of recent changes. One, Souf let go a new supplier, vetted but not yet under contract, and a marketing assistant who'd quit via email 3 weeks before. Nothing concrete, nothing damning, just the usual swirl of ambition and ego you'll find behind any swinging kitchen door. Wolfe dismissed Toiver with a promised Tobin touch, not warmly. As the door closed behind him, Wolfe leaned back, hand stented. Sabotage, Mr. Goodwin, is an art form, and like all art, it demands an audience. Find out who stood to benefit from that dish going wrong. Got it. I said you want the chef's grilled. He raised an eyebrow, question not roasted. I smirked and, headed for my coat. Fritz appeared from the dining room, arms folded. There is no more garlic in the house, he said pointedly. Excellent. Wolfe replied, let you see if we may now digest the truth. And just like that, the brownstone was no longer undisturbed. Knives in the kitchen. If you want to find out who's guilty in a restaurant, don't look at who's sweating. That's everyone look for. Theon, who's too clean. I started with the list. Toiver gave me 6 names, all with reasons to hate each other, work late, and know how to bury a grudge under bechamel. Suspects were all linked to the Ambrosia kitchen or its immediate orbit. Not one of them, according to Tattleiver, could have done it, which, as Wolfe likes to remind me, is usually the chef's signoni of them did one. Natalie Kern, sous chef, recently let go. My first stop was a cafe in Chelsea, where Natalie Kern was currently nursing her wounds and an iced matcher with too much foam. She had the look of someone who used to be respected. Shoulders, still squared, gaze a little too sharp. I didn't poison anything, she said, not even waiting for me to sit. Never said you did, replied, flipping open my notepad for effect. But garlic in a crouton during a launch sounds like a pretty personal seasoning. She snorted. Personal. Bryce Toiver wouldn't know personal if it was flamed and served with foam. He canned Netbo weeks before the opening and didn't even have the guts to do it in person. Sent his little executive assistant with a release letter and a cookie basket. Did you eat the cookies? No, they had walnutsy. Nodded sympathetically. Still, you knew the menu, you knew the team, and you had keys until recently. Natalie leaned einen, a reputation one. I wouldn't risk over a cheap stunt. You want someone with access and a need to prove something. Talk to his new culinary strategist. That will be suspect number 2. Paul Leon, culinary strategist. Paul Leon didn't sound like a chef. He sounded like a bank manager trying to be edgy, but when I tracked him down at Ambrosia between lunch prep and staff briefing, he had the vibe of someone who wore designer aprons and called himself a curator of edible narrative sabotage. He asked, smoothing his oiled hair, "Please, that's a word for amateurs and disgruntled prep cooks. You're not an amateur. I'm an innovator." Said to brought me in to evolve the menu, push boundaries. Not everyone liked it such. As old guard types, Natalie obviously, and some of the investors. Bryce wants to turn Ambrosia into a concept platform. They want truffles and fuga. On repeat. You weren't worried the crouton debacle might reflect on your concept. I designed the overall experience, he said, but not the execution. I don't do garlic, it muddies the palate. No one serious uses it, except the saboteur. He shrugged it. They weren't serious, which was a clever way to Maria Nixon, former marketing assistant. Maria Nixon answered her door in leggings and a Yale hoodie, which did nothing to hide the fact she looked like someone who'd cried herself out of a Joby. Should have stayed in finance, she said, ushering me into an apartment full of unopened Amazon boxes and almond milk cartons. Finance would have been safer. I agreed, but less flavorful. She gave a tired laugh. If you're here about the garlic thing, I heard I didn't do it. Did you leave on good terms? She hesitated. To never liked me, said Elect Vision. All I did was suggest he hire a PR team before the relaunch. Hesed image was for people who didn't have taste, and now someone's giving him bad press. He didn't pay for exactly. I didn't sabotage his menu, but I also didn't cry when it happened. I marked her down as bitter, but plausible. She had no kitchen access, but marketing assistants know everything about timing, coverage, and pressure points. Ivan Caldera, executive chef Ivan Caldera, was a force of nature in a double-breasted jacket. He met me in the back alley of Ambrosia between deliveries, lit a cigarette, and said, if I wanted to ruin a dish, no one would taste it, it would a sapper. Not exactly the defense I'd led with, but it got my attention. You seem calm about the situation. I'm always calm, he said, because I run the kitchen. No one touches my plates without my knowing. This garlic incident, it wasn't about flavor, it was about trust. Yours. He looked at me with eyes like carved granite. Someone wants Toiver to fail. It doesn't mean they want me to fail. They could have done worse damage. It was a warning. Any ideas? Who sent it? I didn't deal in gossip, just veiled threats. He smiled only when deserved. Caldera had the confidence of a man who could control fire with his bare hands. He also had motive. If Tolliver's vision failed, Caldera might end up as head chef somewhere. He didn't have to listen to strategists with Pinterest. Degrees. Janelle Ruxton, investor and silent partner. Janelle Ruxton wasn't silent when I reached her. In fact, she had plenty to say about Toiver and the precious cult of culinary genius he was building. Bryce thinks he's a visionary. Shit sipping a turmeric tonic that looked like it belonged in a lab. But what he is reckless. He plays with money like it's garnish, and you got burned. Not yet, but close. I advised against the relaunch timing. The critics weren't ready, the customers were shifting. He ignored me. Then the garlic thing happened, and now my inbox is full of refund requests and gossip you think Samin's trying to take his credibility. I think someone is reminding him that without his investors, he's just a loudman with a Ruxton had the money and the motive, but not the hands. Still, financial sabotage can wear a chef's apron too. If you know which egos to stir. Clyde Fenning, new supplier, pending contract. Finally, there was Clyde Fenning, owner of Fenning Farms, which had been in negotiations to supply Ambrosia with specialty breads and oils. He was affable, ruddy-faced, and smelled faintly of yeast. He offered Toiver a sample batch, he said, unlabeled. Sure. but everything was standard if someone used the wrong product, that's. On them, did the sample contain garlic, only the sourdough? Twist that's clear in the product sheet. Product sheet that would wear with the box. I swear maybe they didn't read it, or maybe someone wanted to make it look like I screwed up who would benefit. From that, Clyde scratched his chin. Anyone who wanted to keep their current suppliers, or make Toiver look like he's slipping, so we had a disgraced sous chef, a smug strategist, a resentful assistant, a proud chef, a bitter investor, and a potential escapee. Supplier, all with reasons to want Bryce Toiver embarrassed, or worse, when I got back to the brownstone and laid it all out. Wolfe didn't say a word for a full minute, then he muttered, 6 suspectsful useful, none decisive. You want more, I want one. He said, butyl subtle for the truth. He turned toward the globe bar, poured a third of a glass of beer, and sipped slowly. Goodwin. He said, observe them again closely. One of them is not afraid of garlic. One of them is afraid of being caught breadcrumbs. And the bluffs, the difference between field work and legwork, is the shoes. I don't wear loafers to chase leads. And I don't run in brogues unless the house is on fire, or Wolfe's schedule, it's moved up this job, called for my brown. Oxford's sturdy enough. For asphalt subtle enough for eavesdropping, Wolfe gave me no explicit instructions other than observe them again, which is the kind of direction he gives when he's either narrowing the net or hasn't yet decided which way the current is running either. Way it meant I had to do what I do best, go sniffing around with a grin and a pen. My first target was the kitchen, not the Ambrosione, but the metaphorical kitchen, where things get messy. Gossip Natalie Carn agreed to meet me again, this time in a different Chelsea cafe with worse music and a better view of who might be watching. She wore her bitterness the way some women wear perfume, intentionally not legal. I ordered a black coffee and gave her a long look. Let's pretend I said that someone with access to the kitchen wanted to sabotage Toiver without putting their name on the spice rack. What's the easiest way? And she didn't blink. Delivery supplier. She nodded. All it takes is one unlabeled jar, one moment of distraction, and someone off inside to look the other way. You think someone looked the other way? I know someone was paid to. Now she had my attention. I leaned in, giving her the patented Archie squint of skeptical interest. And you didn't mention this, Bor, because Ply didn't have proof. I still don't. But I heard whispers from the dishwashers, one of the line cooks. Remy suddenly showed up with a new scooter. He doesn't even have a licensee. Said it was a gift from whom, no idea. But he was working that night. I bet McNives he didn't wash all those crouton jars just because he loves sanitation. I jotted it down and flagged Remy as a possible vector. Not a mastermind too small, but maybe the helping hand someone needed from there. I hopped over to Ambrosia. Itself, I'd been there before, but this time I wasn't there to eat or impress. I was there to loiter in the alley by the kitchen entrance. I waited until I saw poor Leon glide out with a phone to his ear and a scarf wrapped twice around his throat. Like a Michelin star. He didn't see, maybe I saw him stop by a trash bin, pull something from his coat, and toss it too precisely when he turned the corner. I jogged over and popped the lid. Bingo, a torn notebook, partially soaked, but legible scribbles. In a rushed hand, food costs menu sketches and 2 names underlined. Ruxton and Fenning. A note beside them read, keep pressure option B. I tucked it under my coat and made a mental note that Paul had a longer game going than just menu development. Why keep track of a silent partner and a bread supplier unless you are playing one off the other? Inside the restaurant, I used my old routine, flashing a bad-shaped smile and mentioning many consultation to the front of house manager to get a look around. I was passed to Calera, the executive chef, who met me in his office that looked more like a war room than a break room. Caldera didn't sit back again, said, arms folded, still chewing on a few crumbs. I replied, you ever work it with Fenning before? Once he's competent, pushy, wants a bigger cut than he's worth. Wold. He sabotage you to prove he's indispensable. If he did, he'd use mold note garlic. Calera grunted, and he wouldn't be subtle He's the kind of guy who wants to be thanked for sinking. Thebot, who does subtle around here Calera, stared at me for a beat. Too long. That strategist of tools lay on, guys too polished. I've never seen him taste his own food. It tells you something, it did. I thanked him and took my leave outside I gave. Fanning a call, he was at the farmer's market and agreed to meet me for a quick chat in his van, parked by Thiekerb, like a producer laden. Trojan horse? I'm getting blamed, huh? He said, rubbing his beard with a hand that smelled like thyme. Not blamed-eyed. He sighed. I gave them 6 jars of sample croutons. One was garlic. It was marked clearly. I triple-checked if someone switched them. They did it after I dropped them off. I know what sabotage looks like. And this ain't farmhand sabotage. This is investor-level fat line. Up with a note from Zij. Leon's book Pressure Point's alternate plans. Samina thinking 3 moves ahead asked if he had anyone watching his deliveries. Hesed no, but his assistant had recently left a note and vanished, probably nothing, but possibly another pair of hands moving things before heading back to the brownstone. I made one more stop, Janelle. Ruxton's office, it sat on the 14th floor of a boutique finance firm that handled discreet capital venture translation rich people. She said, arching a brow, should I be flattered or subpoenaed? Neither, I said, told. I be worried that your name is scribbled in a menu designer's notebook. She didn't flinch, Paul. Leon, none other fat child, thinks he's Gordon Ramsay meets Machiavelli. He pitched me an idea for an Ambrosia franchise before the garlic scandal told me. Toiver's name was too dense for expansion. Said he'd take the reins if things adjusted direction, and did. You agree? I told him if he ever wanted $1 from me again, he'd better start making sense with flavor instead of fantasies. So Leon was ambitious, arrogant, and now actively maneuvering against Toiver's credibility. I had a feeling if I peeled his scarf off, I'd find a forked tongue back at the brownstone Wolfe. Had remained planted, of course. I delivered him a report while he sat behind his desk with a bottle of beer in front of him untouched. When I reached the part of booth notebook, he closed his eyes. Leon, he murmured, yes, he is the sort of man. Wow, would. Place garlic where elegance was intended, trying to sabotage Toiver for a coup. Perhaps, but coups are messy. This was precise what else I gave him. Ferris the line. Cook Remy with a new scooter. The assistant who vanished Fenning's alibi and Ruxton's. Disdain when I was done. Wolfe sat for a long moment, fingers interlaced, lips drawn inward. Then we are missing one element. A motive, no a moment. The moment in which the garlic entered the system. Everything else hinges on it. You want me to go back to the kitchen? No. I want someone else to call Saul. That mean things were escalating, more pressure. I asked Morais. He said, we are close. Well, Goodwin, but the next trespass will not be subtle. The jar, the knife, and the note effect wasn't there. There's something about silence in the brownstone that makes your ears itch, not the quiet of a book being read or the murmur of orchids growing. I mean the unnatural kind, thick quiet that comes when you know someone else has touched something they shouldn't. It started. The next morning I came downstairs at 8:13 a.m. I'm exactly 2 minutes behind schedule, thanks to a faulty hot water valve, and I noticed the smell, not the usual comfort of Fritz Vianney's blend and butter toasted rye, but something sharper, slightly metallic, slightly wrong. Fritz. I called, heading into the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, frozen, a dish towel in one hand and a thin 12-inch slicing knife in the other. His face was pale, his brow creased. What is it? I asked. He didn't speak. He pointed the wooden spice rack Wolfe's custom muled. Alphabetized shrine to culinary consistency was off. Specifically, one jar had been moved. It wasn't obvious unless you've spent as many mornings as I have watching Fritz Hamu himself while measuring tarragon like it's plutonium. But there it was. The jar marked SZ dry blend was tilted at an angle slightly backward. The lid looked like it had been screwed shut in haste. He picked it up and gave it a gentle shake. Inside were dried herbs, thyme, sage, a trace of saffron, but mixed in unmistakable were Small flecks of dried garlic. I looked at Fritz. "You keep garlic in here?" His answer was immediate. "Never me Wolf forbids it. We have none, we had none, we had none." I threw it all out when Mr. Wolf requested it anyone in here since online and you. And that's when it hit me someone had been inside the brown stone. A guest, not Toiver, or any of the suspects. Someone else. Someone quiet so mean, who knew exactly what that spice rack meant, and what it would mean to Wolf if tampered with. I brought the jar to Wolf. In the office, he was already seated naturally reading Lemon, gastronomique with the particular look of someone who is finding the French particular le dipting that morning. I set the jar on his desk. He looked at it then at Nero Goodwin someone. Got in. I assume this fear's not from the Ambrosia kitchen, nope. This is ours, Fritz. Swears it was clean garlic free. Now it's not. Wolf stared at the jar for a long time. Then he reached for his phone. Saul Panzer, he said when the line picked up. Now. So arrived 43 minutes later, in a slate gray suit and an expression that said he'd skip breakfast for this. I gave him the rundown, and he began moving through the brownstone like a bloodhound, on Valium, slow, steady, deliberate. By noon, he had a theory, whoever it was. Saul Sathi knew your habits knew when the kitchen would be empty, probably used Akapi. Of the key, no signs of forced entry. They didn't take anything, didn't break anything, they left a message. I said, nodding to the jar. Wolf was seated. Arms crossed, a crude message, the work of animateur and refinement, but a professional in tactics poor. Leon, I asked. Possibly Wolf replied. But Leon is an idea. Man, this was not an idea. This was an act Sosamian working for him. Remy Saul lifted an eyebrow. Ree's scooter is registrato, a Maria Nixon. She bought it 6 days ago. That made me sit up Nixon. The assistant, I asked. She said she hated Toiver's guts. She also. Saul added, once worked as a receptionist for Fenning's distribution office for about 8 months 3 years ago. That web was getting tighter than Fritz's hollandaise. She gets fired. I amused aloud, knows the players, knows the layout. Maybe she bribes or pressures Remy into planting the garlic, or she plants it herself during a visit. Remy lets her in Saul Sade scooters. The thank you Wolf tapped his fingers together. That may account for the restaurant incident, he said, but not for this intrusion. You think it was Nixon? Again, no. Wolf said this intrusion is not from the same mind. The first act was revenge. This, he gestured toward. They are is containment, a warning, or a push toward. What he didn't answer instead, he told Saul to find out who had been in or near the brownstone over the past 48 hours, and to start with any own would touch the key. Wolf kept his own keys locked away, but I had a spare in my coat, so did Fritz, but his hadn't moved. Mine, however, was gone. I turned my room upside down. The coat was there, the pocket wasn't ripped, but the key was missing. Only 2 people had been in the house recently, aside from Wolf, Fritz, and me, Bryce Toiver, and the courier who delivered a wine catalog on Wednesday. Fritz confirmed the catalog had come, but hadn't answered the door. It was already inside the vestibule when he opened it, left by hand. I asked, he nodded. The bell rang when I opened it. No one was there. I called the publisher of the wine catalog. They hadn't said anything. Wolf stood slowly, well, as slowly as Wolf ever did, and approached the J. 2 intrusions, he said. 1 professional, 1 psychological, 1 message of chaos. Theater of control. We are being drawn in not to discover the truth, but to validate it. That's when I saw it on Wolf's desk blotter. Tucked just under the corner of his notepad was a slip of folded paper. I hadn't noticed it when I came in. Wolf didn't keep clutter, especially not loose paper. I picked it up. On it was a single line typed in courier font. You see what he's capable of. What are you going to do about it? No name, no fingerprint, no envelope, just pressure. Wolf read it, and he burned it. Someone is trying, he said, to make me respond, to draw me out, to make this personal, is it? He looked at me, and Ferrance Welf didn't answer. Instead, he rang for Fritz. Tea black, unsweetened, and clear, the spice rack, all of it. That's drastic. I said that's necessary, replied Saul returned that evening with. A short list Toiver hadn't left anything to end, but Paul Leon had shown up at Ambrosia late the night before, unusual but not unheard. Of more interesting was that Maria Nixon had been seen outside Defenning's distribution warehouse that same morning, talking to someone in a white delivery van, whose playing whom he muttered that Wolfe said is what we are about to find out. And just like that, the game had changed. The crouton was never the crime. It was the first note in a symphony of manipulation. And Samian Samin Clever was composing the second movement inside. Our walls a break-in abitrail and a tale on the move, it's one thing for Wolfe to be annoyed. That's routine. What's rare is for him to be interested. And when Wolfe is interested, the air in the brownstone changes. You can feel it in the tension of his voice, the way he repositions his beer glass by millimeters, or the way he doesn't read the newspaper, but watches it like it might confess the intrusion had gotten under his skin. Not because of the garlic Wolfe would rather sit through a 6-hour board meeting with Inspector Kramer and acknowledge fear of anyone Spacino. This was about control. The sanctity of his world had been tampered with, not destroyed, just nudged enough to get his attention. And now someone had it. I was downstairs in my room, changing into something more mobile, when the phone rang. It was Saul. I've got movement, he said. Leon met with Nixon Midtown Cafe, 40 minutes AGA-friendly, too short for friendly, too tense for casual. I grabbed my coat, Saul continued. She passed him something in a manila envelope. He left. She waited 2 minutes, then took a cab south. Where? Sano still tailing. I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe had been right. Someone was escalating. Back upstairs I filled Wolfe in. He barely nodded. Have Saul follow her as far as he can. He said if she stops, he's not to confront, merely observe, right? He tapped a knuckle against his chin and have Fred Durkin watch Leon from his apartment to the restaurant, hand anywhere in between. That told Mezzamething if Saul was watching the periphery and Fred the center. Wolfe thought the game was converging, the circle was tightening. So I made one more call, this time to Fred, gave him the name address. And Target told him to keep it subtle. No trench coats or opera glasses for it, may not have. Saul's finesse, but he knows how to be invisible in a lobby full of mirrors with the nets cast. I returned to Ambrosia that afternoon under the guise of collecting further statements. Calera met. You still digging? He asked, chopping shallots with unnerving precision, gesturing over the loam that implies you think something's growing here. I know something's festering. He smirked. You always talk like that, only when I'm right in the prep. Kitchen, I asked around Remy. Wasn't there called out sick? Nobody I had seen. Nixon since her resignation. Paul Leon hadn't come in that day. With this last menu draft was still open on the shared kitchen tablet. I got a glance at it. 2 things stood out. A revised third course now labeled crouton-free panzanella. A note in the margin. Ask Janelle for final decision. Before pushing, I took a photo out back. The alley was empty except for crates, a few cigarette butts, and a crumpled delivery slip not from Fenning, some generic supply outfit I didn't recognize, but if that a line item that caught my eye, specialty sample jar marked Herb's Composite. There was no recipient signature, no timestamp, and the handwriting looked familiar back at the brownstone. I dropped the slip on Wolfe's desk. Someone's leaving breadcrumbs. I said, only they don't want us to follow Fenthy, want us to think we have. Wolfe looked at the slip. He didn't touch it. This, he said, is a forgery, you sure? I nodded. Fritz's handwriting, but altered, a poor mimic, politely traced from a note he sent recently. So whoever planted the garlic also wanted us to suspect the kitchen, but not the restaurant kitchen. Our kitchen, that, I admit, chilled me a bit. You think someone's trying to pit you against the case. Someone wants me out of it, to declare it beneath me, tainted. They have failed. That was when the knock came at the front door. Not the bell, not a client's knock. Clients, not a delivery. It was urgent, tight, angry. I opened it and found Bryce Toiver hadn't wait for an invitation. He stormed. past me and into the office like he owned it, holding a folder in one hand and his temper in the other. Wolfe didn't rise. Mr. Toiver threw the folder on the desk. "It's gone," Wolfe blinked. "What is gone?" "The proposal, my expansion filler restaurant plans. Private investors, it was in my office. Now it's gone." "And why?" Wolfe said calmly. "Are you here instead of the police?" "Because only one person had access besides me. And he works for you." The room chilled. I half-stepped forward. "Careful," Leon Toiver barked. "You said you were watching him. I trusted you." Wolfe studied him. "And yet the file is gone, which means someone wanted it found missing. That does not require theft. It requires misplaced. You think this is a bluff?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that someone wants." Younstable reacted. "Someone who profits when you panicked." His jaw tightened. He went this resolved. Now Wolfe sipped his beer. "Takenly leave my house. I shall summon you when the moment is correct." Toiver glared, then turned and stomped out. When the door shut, Wolfe sighed. "Emotional Aladdin," he muttered. "I despise it." 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was Sol Nixon. Went into a tenement on the Lower East Side, 3rd floor. Came out without envelope. "Did you go in?" I asked. "No, but I saw someone else come out." "Paul Leon." He paused. "And Goodwin." "He wasn't alone." "Who was with him?" "Remy." "So they were working together." Wolfe tapped the desk. "Essay relayed this." Leon gives Nixon the envelope. She hides it. Leon retrieves it with the line cook who may have planted the original garlic. He leaned back. "They are no longer hiding. They are closing the trap." "What's in the envelope?" "Insurance, perhaps. A fake investor list. Perhaps a blackmail document. Whatever it is, they intend to use it soon. And the jar in our kitchen. A test. If I called the police, I'd look paranoid. If I ignored it, I'd look indifferent. Either response discredits me. But now," he pointed a thick finger toward the floor. "No. I maneuver." That night, Saul and Fred remained on watch. Wolfe called a locksmith. "Changed the locks. Replaced the keys. Fritz, boil these spice jars in vinegar and holy water, just in case." And Wolfe dictated 12 letters, one to Janelle Ruxton, inviting her to a culinary inquiry. The other till tomorrow. He said the suspects would gather. And Wolfe would do what he does best: serve the truth. Cold, quiet moves, loud consequences. If you've never seen Nero Wolfe go on the offensive, don't expect him to stand up and point fingers. That's for courtroom dramas and cheap detective flicks. Wolfe widges. Or the same way, he tends his orchids with controlled atmosphere, precise timing, and just enough heat to make things bloom or wilt the morning after. Tover's tantrum and Saul's surveillance update. Wolfe's tempo shifted, not visibly. He still sat at his desk, still indulged his usual breakfast of poached eggs and beer. But the air had changed. I know the signs. The longer pauses before answering, the slower sips of beer. The fact that he reread the Gazette's food column 3 times before discarding it. He was tuning the strings beefer, the final performance after breakfast. He gave me a list, not a Longon, but pointed 3 calls to make, 2 packages to deliver, 1 to receive first. The list: Janelle Ruxton. I rang her office and told her that Wolfe was formally inviting her to a private meeting that afternoon at the Brownstone. Her reply was tour, of course. "He is second Clyde Fenning?" Wolfe asked that. I inform him of a potential conflict with Paul Leon's business interests, a phrase Wolfe carefully dictated and had me repeat 3 times before using. Fenning didn't say much in return, but I could almost hear his eyebrows raising over the line. 3rd Bryce Toiver. Wolfe told me to deliver a sealed envelope to him personally. Inside was a typed note with a single sentence: "Control is not a menu item. You have 1 course left to 10. I delivered it at Ambrosia, handed it to him without acrimony, and walked away before he could argue. I found the best way to make a matter of us is to give him silence. When he expects a plea back at the Brownstone, Wolfe had Fritz preparing 2 tea services and enough cold meats to feed a jury. When I asked if he was expecting company or thou siege, he simply grunted. At 1:05 p.m. a package arrived, small, wrapped in heavy brown paper, no return address. Wolfe didn't touch it. He had me open it carefully on the dining room table. Inside was a thumb drive. Just that Wolfe nodded, as if he'd expected a severed ear, and was mildly disappointed. Inserted Fritz, brought Theophis. Laptop Wolfe doesn't allow it near the orchids, and I did the honors. It contained a single video file. Low resolution, no timestamp, but it was Ambrosia's kitchen. Clearly a hidden camera, possibly a prep station feed. I pressed play. It showed Remy the line cook alone. He was moving between the dry storage and the herb rack. He opened a jar identical to the one we'd found in her kitchen and spooned something into a prep bowl labeled course 3. Then he wiped the counter and walked away. 30 seconds later, Paul Leon entered. He didn't see the camera. He didn't need to. He looked at the prep bowl, sniffed it, and smiled. Then he took out a small notebook and scribbled something. The file ended there. That Wolfe said is not evidence. It is an invitation. Someone wants us to see that Leon's involved. Yes, but not to prove it or weaponize it against Oliver or me. That remains the question. The stage was set at 300 p.m. Sharp. Guests began arriving first. Janelle Ruxton, wearing a charcoal gray pantsuit, and the expression of a woman who'd already written everyone in the room out of her will. Second, Clyde Fenning, cheeks red from the cold coat, still dusted with flour like he'd walked out of a baking storm. Third, Paul Leon, smooth as ever in a patterned scarf and camel coat, holding a leather folio like he expected to sign contracts before cocktails. Fourth, Maria Nixon. This surprised me, since she hadn't been formally summoned, but she came anyway quietly and took the far corner seat in the office like someone waiting for judgment. Finally, Rice Toiver, hair unkempt, tie askew, folder under his arm, and eyes wild from too many half-slept nights. Wolfe let the silence stretch as they seated themselves. Fritz closed the doors. I stood against the bookshelves. Wolfe began without standing. Of course I have asked you here, he said, not to deliver a solution, but to confirm a pattern. The sabotage of Mr. Toiver's kitchen was not culinary. It was strategic. It was meant to cause embarrassment, erode credibility, and most crucially provoke a reaction. Paul Leon shifted slightly. Thruxton crossed one leg over the other. This began with garlic. Wolfe continued, but its essence is ambition. One or more of you believes Mr. Toiver is unfit to lead his business. That is not an uncommon belief among subordinates or stakeholders. What is uncommon is translating that belief into action. Leon smiled. Tight, you make it sound like a coup. It is Wolfe, said a coup. One veiled in vinaigrette that got a snort from Fenning. Wolfe continued, nearing them. Maria Nixon was the vector. She had the means, the connections, and the grudge. She facilitated the first incident, the garlic sabotage, by working through Remy, who was compensated indirectly. A scooter purchased in her name traced poorly. Maria didn't deny it. She looked at her shoes. She did not act alone. Poor Leon provided the motive. He presented investors with alternative visions. He drafted an expansion plan without Tover's knowledge. He undermined Caldera's kitchen authority through back channels speculation. Lion said sharply. Wolfe gestured to me. I stepped forward and played the video. When I tended, the room was dead quiet. That proves nothing, Leon said. It proves you knew. Wolfe replied. You knew what had been placed in the dish, and you documented it because you needed it to happen. Leon opened his mouth, but Wolfe cut him off. You are not the architect. You are the accelerant. The real force was emotional. Miss Nixon's resentment. Your ambition, Mr. Toiver's volatility. Someone likely you realized that by planting the right pressure points, you could call up second fiddles in Tover's leadership and position yourself as the Nixon. Fenning cleared his throat. I was approached, he said, about backing a new brand. They wanted to cut Toiver out, said the name had become reputation. Alabama. Wolfe nodded. And you declined. I said I'd consider it. But after this, I am considering fireballing my own bakery. Have left Ruxton. Wolfe turned to her. You were the safety net. If Leon succeeded, you would benefit publicly or quietly. If he failed, you would emerge untouched, a shareholder with no fingerprints. She didn't deny it. Wolfe looked At Toiver last, sir, he said, you are a flawed leader, you alienate your staff. You dismiss strategy, but your enemies were not interested in reform. They were interested in replacement, to said nothing then held at Leon, your fired Leon Rosemouth. Twisted you think I'll go quickly, no Wolfe. Said I think you'll go Fred, open the office door. Leon walked out. Nixon behind him, Ruxton stood nodded to Wolfe, and followed silent as always. Fenning gave Wolfe a long look, and said, hell of a salad, huh? When they were gone, Wolfe finally exhaled. I asked him, satisfied? He nodded once, and then hesed. Now I am hungry. Sliced, cold, served, precise. You can always tell when Wolfe's ready to deliver the final blow. Not because he raises his voice. He doesn't or stands. He won't or slams a fist on the E. Desk he'd rather perish, no Wolfe. Signals his readiness with an axle. Subtle it should come with a neon sign. He pushes his beer glass exactly 3 inches to the left and folds. His hands like a judge, waiting to sentence a guilty man that's the pose. He took now as the brownstone's office filled with the ripe scent of winter. Coats in unresolvation. This wasn't our first rodeo, but something about this particular group of suspects, so polished, so pointed, felt more like a curated tasting menu than a criminal buffet. Each had been trimmed, plated, and arranged for optimal exposure. Back in their seats, Bryce Toiver, hands clenched tight, the tips of his ears flushed with either anger or shame. Janelle Ruxton still calm, still calculating her silence. A sharper weapon than most arguments. Clyde Fenning looking as if he wished he were back kneading sourdough instead of reputation's Marianne Nixon, stone-faced corner, seated again as if choosing invisibility as her final defense. Paul Leon, conspicuously absent, escorted out last section, and by Wolfe's decree, not invited back his. Exit had been loud enough. Fourth whole block. Saul Panzer was present this time too, posted near the door. Ikea. Quiet punctuation marked no words from him. Just ice always. I stood beside. Wolfe, pad in hand, more for effect than at taking the truth was already written now. It was Wolfe's job to read it aloud. He began without pleasantries. We are not here to debate flavor profiles. He said we are not here to evaluate business plans or vent professional grievances. We are here to excise a rot. No one spoke. Wolfe continued, voice low and smooth. The garlic, as you all now understand, was never the crime. It was a signal one meant to attract attention, incite suspicion, and invite collapse. His gaze passed across them like a slow-moving beam, but to collapse something effectively, one must first understand its load-bearing walls. Mr. Toiver, he said, you are many things: arrogant, impulsive, largely self-involved, but you are not a saboteur. You are not clever enough for that. You were targeted because you were predictable. To said nothing. He had the good sense not to argue. Wolfe turned next to Maria. Miss Nixon, you were used, not entirely unwillingly. I suspect, but still used. You planted nothing in the kitchen yourself, but you facilitated it. You paid Remy the line cook to cooperate. You coordinated deliveries. You may even have composed the note slipped into my office, an amateur tactic, but one meant to provoke. Her lips parted. You were promised a seat at a new table. Wolfe Cuden by Mr. Leon. Maria looked away then. Wolfe faced Fenning. Mr. Fenning, you were almost innocent. Your bread samples were legitimate, clearly labeled. But Mr. Layup knew your products. While he mimicked your jars, he exploited the ambiguity of your temporary contract. Fenning shifted. Jaw tightening. He used me. Yes, Wolfe said. Hash used Miss Nixon as he tried to use Mr. Toiver's implosion. As a ladder, he turned last to Janelle Ruxton. Your role. Ms. Ruxton was passive in action, but active in outcome. You were approached by Mr. Leon with an alternate expansion plan. You declined publicly, but you did not report it. You waited if he succeeded. You benefited if he failed. You remained untouched. Ruxton didn't flinch. I invest in potential. She said quietly, Leon was potential, but I didn't. Sabotage, Toveno. Wolfe replied, but you didn't protect him either. That is your sin, not criminal, but cowardly. Wolfe allowed silence to settle. Then he resumed. Mr. Leon's ambition exceeded his discretion, when his efforts to gain influence through traditional channels failed, when Toiver rejected his ideas and Fenning withheld exclusive contracts, he turned to subterfuge, garlic and the Croutons, a planted delivery slip an intrusion into my house seat that he looked squarely at. Maria with my own key lifted during your first visit, Maria palled it. Then Wolfe went on a fabricated Aspar fave. Toiver's expansion file meant to rattle him further. And finally he held up a small USB drive. This a video meant not to prove guilt, but the planet delivered anonymously. Sent with precise timing suggesting Leon knew you were closing in and wished to point the finger at Remy Allen exonerating himself. He placed the drive on the desk like a gavel, Mr. Leon failed Becca's. He underestimated intelligence, not mine, but that of those around him. Miss Nixon, you began to doubt him the moment he refused to include you in his final plans. You were used and discarded in Fenning. You realized too late that a new contract would come at the cost of your integrity and Miss Roxton. Even you sensed the PR backlash was no longer survivable. Wolfe leaned back, satisfied Mr. Leon has already been confronted with these facts. He has confessed partially enough to place him in the line of civil, if not criminal culpability. The rest will be resolved by Mr. Toiver's legal counsel. He looked to Tolliver. You are, as I said, flawed, but you are not destroyed, because your enemies failed to understand the nature of loyalty. They mistook fear for silence, compliance for loyalty, and they forgot that even a crouton properly seasoned can bite back. It was admittedly a strange note to end on, but this is Wolfe, not Shakespeare. Toiver ran a hand through his hair and gave a small nod. Thank you, he said. Then to Miss Surprise added, really? Ruxton offered Wolfe a parting glance. It was almost respect. Fenning muttered something about brewing stronger coffee. Maria left without a word when the door finally closed and the brownstone was quiet again. Wolfe sighed, then he rang for Fritz. Dinner will be taken in the dining room. He said something light. I've had my fill of drama. You want salad? I asked. Wolfe grimaced. Only if it's missing garlic. Ambition and betrayal. The architect exposed. There are retro kinds of silence in Wolfe's office. The first is the kind that settles in naturally like a satisfied diner leaning back after the last course. That's the good kind. The kind Wolfe prefers. There's the other kind. The kind that buzzes like a leftover fly in the room circling, waiting to land. Somewhere inconvenient, that second silence was what lingered after the suspects departed, after the USB drive was stored in Wolfe's personal lockbox, and after for it served a delicate trout salad that even Wolfe barely touched. Wolfe hadn't spoken a word for 37 minutes, I counted. Then finally Hesed, he played a long game. I was at my desk, boots off, flipping through the notes we'd assembled over the past week. Leon, of course. Leon Wolfe said he laid every piece with deliberation. What astonishes me is how close he came. He picked up his beer, took a sip, then set it down in precisely the same spot he knew. Toiver was vulnerable as I clicky. Professionally, he saw that the board was fracturing. That expansion was more fantasy than feasible. So he engineered an incident that would cause just enough doubt to erode the empire. Not destroy it, just make it pliable, and he used Nixon and Remy to do the dirty work. Yes, Nix, undiscarded from the marketing wing, still believed she deserved more. Leon gave her attention and promises he gave Remy cash and a toy scooter. Childish but effective. I stood and started pacing. But head garlic, he had to know. It wouldn't tank the restaurant outright. It didn't need to, Wolfe replied. It had to introduce uncertainty. Customers want to believe HF is omnipotent. A single misstep undermines that illusion. I sat agape, and came the intrusion here. Why risk that? That wasn't about risk. Wolfe said that was about testing me, seeing if I would retreat. Leon thought me aloof, arrogant. He assumed I'd find the matter distasteful and dismiss it when I didn't. He increased pressure. He sent the forged dice slip. Wolfe nodded. And the video too conveniently timed too. Conveniently placed, designed to push Eustoward. Remy giving Leon the chance to slip away as the unfortunate observer he almost got away with. It he would have if not for Miss Nixon's hesitation. Her evil today was not accidental. She came because she realized she'd been used, and unlike Leon, she was not prepared to shoulder blame. It added up Leon had been the architect, but hadn't acted. Alone he had moved people around like chess pieces, calculating every step the garlic, the delivery jar note under, Wolfe's desk blotter, the conveniently missing expansion, file aloft at frame to collapse Tolliver's authority while preserving plausible. Know where to plant the jar here, I asked Wolfe, turned to me the courier, the Winnicatalaga ruse. He employed someone likely freelance to enter during Fritz's midday prep hour. They used a key lifted by Ms. Nixon during her initial visit placed the jar, and left subtle trespass no fingerprints, only a question. And Thenope Wolfe smiled faintly. That was Leon's mistake. It was too clever if you intend to mislead me. You do not leave an anonymous message attempting to moralize me into action, he wrote. It as if I weareth audience, but I'm not led by narrative cues. I am led by facts. Ickle tried telling that to the people reading this. He didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and produced the note. Theon. He had supposedly burned, the edges were singed, but the center remained. Wolfe had only scorched it, not destroyed it. He handed it to me. I read it again. You see what he's capable of. What are you going to do about it? Wolfe said it was a promptprod, a psychological hook. He wanted me to react. I refused. So what changed? Leon overplayed his hand. He inserted himself into the frame, too confident when the video appeared. He thought I'd leap on it. Instead, I waited, and he walked into the trap. Wolfe nodded. He revealed more by anticipating my conclusion than by defending himself a beat past. Then Wolfe said, Leon fancied himself my equal. It was his true flaw. I leaned back, arms folded. We've had worse villains. We've had louder ones. Wolfe corrected, but few as meticulous. I asked, what happens now? Tolliver will survive barely. He will restructure. Miss Roxton will consolidate influence. Mr. Fenning will remain independent wisely. Miss Nixon will fade into the corporate shadows. Where she is safest, Remy will deny everything and likely find another kitchen that pays in cigarettes and scooters. And Leon, he will be sued silently, civil court. No headlines, just consequence. I let the silence settle again. Then I said, you didn't have to take this case. No, Wolfe said, but someone left garlic in my house. And that, I think, was the real trigger. Not the crouton, not the sabotage, the invasion of his private order, his haven. That's the thing about Wolfe. Push him, and he'll ignore you. Intrude on him, and he'll swat you like a fly. Manipulate him. Then you'd better be perfect. Because if you're not, you'll end up in that chair with Wolfe, quietly dissecting your entire motive like a fish on ice. And once he starts carving, he doesn't stop until there's nothing left but bones. A final bite of Justice's Day. After the final gathering, the brownstone returned to form like a snapped rubber band, taut, precise, infinitely resentful of the disruption. The kitchen had been sanitized twice, once by Fritz, once by Wolfe's mood, and the spice rack stood reborn, each jar inspected under Fritz's glower like they'd personally betrayed him. Saul and Fred were off the clock. The phone didn't ring, and Wolfe went back to Heisertsch's for a full 2-hour session. As if garlic had never passed through our sacred halls, still something hung in fear, not tension, exactly, more like reflection, a residue left by confrontation. Now slowly settling, I was in the office reorganizing the case files. Wolfe prefers paper records. He doesn't trust digital storage unless it's backed up 3 times and hidden in a vault under Switzerland. So I was elbow deep in transcripts, statements, and 3 separate folder tabs labeled Leon variants. He broke the silence at 11:42. A .m, which is early for post-case philosophizing. He didn't look at me when he'd said it, just stared out the window, watching the December sky attempt snowdo. You know why I dislike ambition, Mr. Goodwin. I didn't look up because it involves movement, no. A pause because it cloaks itself in justification. It wears integrity like a borrowed coat that's poetic. It's tragic, Wolfe corrected. Had turned his chair slightly enough to see me from the corner of his eye. Leon believed he deserved control because he had vision, but vision unned from restraint is just vanity. I closed the final folder. He wanted the spotlight, not the stove precisely. He spoke of cuisine as if it were philosophy, yet treated his colleagues like disposable parts in a clockwork machine. I set the folders down, leaned against the edge of my desk. So he tried to break the machine and failed because he never learned how to listen or wait. Wolfe picked up a new orchid book from the pile near his elbow. He turned the cover slowly. With reverence, there is a species of orchid, he said, native to Madagascar, Angram. Sesquipedal Darwin predicted it had a pollinator with an extraordinarily long proboscis, simply by observing the flower structure. Hare's peers mocked him in years. Later, it was found a moth with a tongue long enough to reach the nectar. Darwin was correct, not because he saw the moth, but because he understood. Thetis and I raised an eyebrow, and Leon was to know Darwin. He was a child playing with diagrams there. Was a knock at the door. Fritz, punctual, has always stepped in with a tray, soft-boiled eggs, toasted sourdough, sliced cucumber, and blessed lino. Garlic. Wolfe looked at the plate as if it might speak. Thank you, Fritz. Fritz nodded and exited. I poured myself coffee and sat down. Wolfe began buttering his toast, each stroke deliberate, as if calming the day into place. You think Toiver will bounce back? I asked. Huel bellow, not bounce. But yes, he will persist. Loud men often do, and Ruxton Shul tighten her grip quietly. What about Nixon? He paused, considered. She will take a job beneath her, feel underappreciated, then eventually depop her into competent mediocrity. I nodded. She's lucky it didn't go criminal. She's lucky she chose guilt over loyalty. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Wolfe dabbed at the corner of his mouth with a cloth napkin, then leaned back. There is comfort in conclusion, he said, but it is a fragile comfort. How so? Hedrond to look at me fully now, because it implies an end, an ambition. True ambition does not end, it waits. It shifts. It finds new hosts. I finished my cafeso. We'll be back here again in some form. He rose slowly. The meal complete, the appetite sated, mind sharpened. That is why we remain vigilant. Is why I do not forgive intrusion, not because of pride, but because it is the beginning of decay. And because you hate garlic, that too. We moved to the office. I set the fire, and Wolfe took his chair, his proper place, as if restored to it by natural law. He opened a book, one of those dense philosophical volumes he reads when he wants to pretend he's not listening to me. I sat, pad in hand, nothing to read outside. Snow began to fall, thin, sparse, not yet serious, but steady. Wolfe looked up from his book. You did well, Archie. I blinked. You say that like it hurts a doze, but nonetheless it is true. I grinned. Then you'll forgive me. I takied night off dinner with Lily. I will not forgive it, but I will allow it progress. He returned to his book. I put on my coat and turned toward the door. Wolfe, I said, yes. What would you have done if Leon had succeeded? He didn't look up. I would have closed the brownstone, and I stopped seriously. Yes, because of one man, because of what it would have meant, that manipulation and spectacle had triumphed over reason that would have been intolerable. I nodded. Well, good thing he lost. Yes, Wolfe said quietly, for all of use he left. Then stepping into the cold snow, brushing my coat collar, the city stretching out in front of me, messy, loud, ambitious. But back in the brownstone bend thick walls and careful silences. Justice had been served, even if it didn't come with croutons. Wolfe's table set, an undisturbed. Wolfe once told me, there are three great comforts in life: symmetry, solitude, and soul. Though not necessarily in that order. After the case of the Crouton conspiracy, I would have added one more: silence, not the kind born off tension or threat, but the honest kind, the calm that comes when the last shoes drop. The last lies confessed. And you've lived to be see it. It was 2 days after the final office showdown. The brownstone had recovered nicely. No more intruders, no more garlic frits, had even reinstated the citrus-scented vinegar polish. Wolfe insists on for the wood paneling everything. Smelled like restraint and lemon. I was in the kitchen helping Fritz unpack a delivery nusafran from Valencia, some nut oils, and a suspicious-looking tin of paprikafet. Wolfe made me hand carry back to the vendor in person. Mr. Wolfe Fritz had said that. Morning wishes only to deal in precision. That's the thing after all thief fireworks, all the subtle trespass, and long game ambition. The aftermath feltedly peaceful like the quiet you get not after a storm, but after a carefully controlled burn. Bad brush had been cleared upstairs in the office. Wolfe was writing a letter to the board of Teuver Culinary Group, a short one confirming facts detailing Lyon's orchestrated manipulations and offering no suggestion Schweitzer Wolfe doesn't offer. Business advice he offers clarity, and Teuver, now appropriately shaken, would take that clarity and run it through his lawyers before ever serving another salad as for Leon Hewitt in jail. Wolfe doesn't aim for steel bars when intellect is a sharper punishment, but the civil suit was already underway. 2 investors had withdrawn their backing. The press had gotten wind of an internal ethics scandal and were circling like seagulls around a dropped cross. Leon's career as a visionary was reduced to footnotes and paralegal transcripts. Maria Nixon had us sappered into quiet marketing departments, somewhere safe, somewhere dull. Her ambition now shelved under lessons learned Remy. The Scooter Happy Line cook had moved on to a fusion pop-up in Williamsburg. The Scooter stolen 2 days later irony. Thy name is unpaid bribe Fenning. Remained independent. He even sent us a holiday basket with a polite note. Thank you for not letting the yeast rise too high. The man has a way with bread and metaphors. And Janelle Ruxton, still silent, still dangerous. But she hadn't made a move since the office showdown, probably because Wolfe had read her so cleanly. She knew any more movement would only deepen the cut. It came upstairs with the mail and found Wolfe back in his chair, reading the Orchid Growers Monthly, like nothing had ever happened. I dropped the letters on his desk and took my place across from him. You know, I said, for a man who claims to loathe disruption, you sure attract your share of it. He glanced up. I do not attract it. I permit it briefly. And this time, he said. Was necessary, I nodded. You think Teuver learned anything? No. But those around him did. That is sometimes the better outcome. I grinned. Philosophical Wolfe, careful. You're sounding almost hopeful. Bar. He reached for his beer and took a sip. Then he said, do you know what the tragedy is, Mr. Goodwin? Besides the croutons he ignored, that the tragedy is that ambition properly applied is not ruinous. It can be civil as injuvating. But once you tether ambition to insecurity, once a man like Leon begins to believe that control is a birthright and not a responsibility, then he becomes a danger you disarmed. He inclined his arm head, slightly, not with weapons, he said, but with understanding, and there it was the reason. Wolfe always wins, even when he doesn't leave the house, because while the rest of the world chases leads and motives and dramatic reveals, Wolfe watches, and when the time is right, he makes a single devastating observation that undoes a web of lies without lifting a single finger. Dinner in 40. Fritz called from the kitchen. Roast duck, I asked, with orange glaze. Came the Ripley. Wolfe smiled faintly and set his magazine aside. We may eat in the dining room. I stood stretched and followed him as we moved through the hallway. Wolfe paused by the spice rack. The new jars gleamed like soldiers in formation. He reached out and tapped one parley properly arranged. He murmured, even chaos may be useful. That was as close as come to celebrating a win. At the table, Fritz served the duck with his usual ceremony. Wolfe closed his eyes after the first bite. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. Outside the city churned the world. Spawn inside the brownstone, was still no trespass.